Hey, all, welcome to Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt. My conversation today is with Stanley Hauerwas, famed theologian, ethicist, and Christian teacher, advocate, sort of. You're going to get to that at the end. It's about a 35-minute conversation, and at the end, we have this conversation about where virtue, which is the theme of his book, is found and passed along. And he suggests the church in a way that's really interesting, confusing to me. But anyway, the book is called The Character of Virtue, Letters to A Godson. And I will mention that the very first minute and a half or so has a bit of a different audio feel. I had to bring in audio from a different source because I messed up a button. But here you go. And I think you'll enjoy it. So here it is, my conversation with Stanley Hauerwas. Deal for you. I know you've written many a book, Stanley Hauerwas, but this one feels like it's a little bit special. Do you feel that way? That there's?
Yeah, I feel that this is a different kind of book than I normally write, and I don't think it's the difference between academic and non-academic books. I think it's in a way more personal. It's in that way it's closer to the memoir that I did, Hannah's Child, than it is some of my other books.
Yeah, and so for people who haven't yet found their way to this book, it's a series of letters that you write to your godson, which is
Right.
which is such an interesting concept, that you would write letters to a young boy from the time he's born.
It's Sam Wells' fault.
Yeah.
When Sam and Joe Wells, when he was dean of the chapel here, and Joe was head of the Anglican Episcopal House of Studies, they asked me to be one of the godparents when Laurie was born, and I said, I'm honored to do so, but I'm such a terrible godparent, I never know what to do. I mean, you say take God seriously or something like that. And Sam said, well, I'll give you an assignment. Every year on the anniversary of his baptism, you are to write commending a virtue to him. And I didn't set out to write them to be a book, but as it evolved, it seemed increasingly likely that might make some sense. So that's how the project happened.
And that started in in the year 2000. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so for 17 years, you've
no,
done
14.
14 years.
Yeah. Well, actually 15 altogether. Right.
And I'm so interested for you, the process of what that meant for you. I mean, there's one sense in which you're writing to this young boy, right? And he's an infant, and he's not going to read this for years. So you recognize that he's going to be changing over time as he reads this. But over 15 years, Stanley Hauerwas was changing as you were writing this, and your career and your thinking and yourself. Did you feel that as you went back and looked over these letters, that there was an arc of your own transition and change and development for you as a person as much as what you were hoping for Laurie?
I think what I realized as I read back through them is my death was increasingly apparent to me. I say I'm 77. I'm beginning to understand that death is not a theoretical possibility even for me.
Yeah.
And so I noticed that was entering into some of my reflections that I was writing to Laurie.
When you were first given the assignment, hey, write to him a virtue, each year. That's a very, I know that sort of fits into your way of thinking and your understanding of ethics and all. But it's an unusual category. How did you decide which virtues you wanted to address in which particular order? Like, as you're thinking about how he would read these.
Yeah, I tried to think about the virtues that were most appropriate to his development. I mean, I started with kindness because children are not kind. and they need to be to learn. You don't pull the kitty's tail, and that they learn to be kind by the kitty wants to be petted. You don't become virtuous by trying to inculcate the virtue in and of itself. You come to virtue by its riding on the back of certain practices that you discover you cannot live well without. And so in the second year, since I assumed Laurie was beginning to talk, I thought he needed to think about truthfulness, because as soon as we learn to talk, we learn to lie. And those are the ways I tried to think through the various virtues I chose in terms of the kind of developments in his body and in his living that this virtue would appear.
Now, you started this project in the early 2000s, and at that same time, in 2001, Time magazine distinguished you as America's best theologian, which I didn't even know there was a category back in 2001 that there was the best.
Actually, it was the best theologian in America.
Best theologian in America. Okay, with a slight qualification. That's a bit of a heady thing to go on. Was there any sense that as you were writing to Laurie in these books or in these letters that was a writing to him? Did that feel different to you coming from your own life and heart as opposed to the public person you were at the Duke Divinity School?
No, I never. I've never taken any of that very seriously. Mm-hmm. It's true. That when our publicity person came to tell me that I was named this, my first response was, best is not a theological category. I think if you let the public media determine your existence, you're in deep trouble.
Yeah. What phrase would you have connected to better? What theological category would you have said? Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. I've worked toward that.
He has been a faithful expositor of the Christian gospel.
And for you, that plays out, and I think this is at the heart of the book, that being an expositor of the Christian gospel, that plays out in a particular way in your thinking, doesn't it? Like it's not just Go ahead.
I hope it does.
Yeah.
I think, though, there is, Doug, in this book, a more explicit understanding of how our natural bodies and passions are begging to be habituated in the virtues. And therefore, it's not like Christianity is some alien tradition you dump on yourself and others, but it is the explication of what it means to be a human being.
So you're saying that it's rooted more in the full human experience than it is an external demand from a religious or cultural system.
Right.
So that's one of the things I wanted to ask you is, are virtues, it's such a curious word. I was spending some time looking it up and realizing that it's usage. I don't know if you saw that there's a chart in the Wikipedia description of virtues that shows its diminishing usage since the middle 1800s. It's like a steady,
I hadn't.
It's like a steady downline on how often it's been used in publications. So it's an interesting concept that feels like it has sort of left the vernacular. Like people don't think about virtues. I don't know. Maybe we think about behaviors or character qualities or personal strengths.
Yeah, right.
What do you think? What as you think about a virtue, as you were writing them to your godson, what do you think is the essence of a virtue versus a practice or a temperament or a personal strength?
It's in the ancient Greek reflections on the virtues.
Mm-hmm.
The virtues are powers that provide the possibility of doing what otherwise could not be done. So they would speak of the virtue of a knife in a way that it was sharp and it could cut in the way that knives were supposed to cut. The virtues are not impositions from on high, but rather they are alternative practices that give us possibilities that we otherwise would not have. How you individuate the virtues and how you understand the relation between the virtues is an ongoing discussion. The reason, I think, one of the reasons that the language of virtue, and I've spent a lifetime trying to have us reflect about the nature of the moral life in the language of the virtues rather than the language of decisions. The reason that I think that virtue language has not been as prominent is it requires a communal discernment about what is significant, and that has become increasingly doubtful.
You say it requires a communal discernment.
Yes. And that discernment is usually in the form of a narrative that helps us see what is important and what is not important for the living of our lives.
That's so interesting that you put it that way, because I guess I have this impression, or when I think of a virtue and a virtuous person, I think of, like, the image that comes to my mind is the virtuous person is the one that stands apart from the crowd. They're the one with true courage or charity or love or value. And they're different from all the rest. And there's a few people that we know in our lives who are virtuous, and all the rest of us, we're stuck with our vices. But those virtuous people are different from the rest of us. And you seem to be saying, no, there's something it requires a communal, collective engagement for a person or a people. Can you reflect at all on where that impression that I have comes from, or how you think about that? This sort of
because I think you think of it that way because, in fact, there's a good deal of truth in that description.
Okay.
But the very virtues that the person that stands out embody are virtues that are communally discovered.
Oh.
So it's not like it's an individual achievement. They have reflected a set of practices correlative to the story that have shaped our lives.
Yeah.
Some people just do it better than others.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think there's this sense of maybe we do with virtues in our society what we do with kind of superheroes or something, where we create this mentality that we will put that ability off. Somebody will be our proxy. So people will want to be in a church community, and they'll want the pastor to carry a certain level of virtue. So she has to be above reproach. But the rest of us, we don't need to be, because I have someone who does. I'm part of a community where someone holds that virtue at its highest, and it tends to let people off the hook with that kind of a mentality. Do you think virtues are? And I want to talk about the particular ones that you write about to your grandson. But do you think virtues are equally achievable for each of us?
No, I don't. I think how our temperament interacts with certain ways of life means for some people certain ways of living will be more challenging than other ways.
Like what comes to mind for you about that? Do you have a specific in mind that seems really obvious?
a shy person may not have the same ability to acquire friends in the way that someone that is more gregarious. But if they do acquire friends, they may well do that in a way that is more substantive than those that are just naturally gregarious.
Oh, interesting. Like the people who are more bent toward that might have a easier time gaining that virtue, but a less deeply held impact of that virtue. Huh?
Right.
Yeah. You have been described both in the book and in the promotion around the book, and sort of in your life as a famously gruff, salty person, and there's even an introduction that Samuel Wells, who's the father of Laura,
right,
who you write the book to, says it's kind of an interesting thing that Stanley starts with kindness, because he's often asked, how can your gruff personality match it doesn't seem to match the impression people have of kindness. And I think you do something really important with that around, the kindness is not just interpersonal sentimentality or can you talk a bit about that, about the difference between the heart of a virtue versus the sort of initial impression that people have of what the virtue would look like?
Again, that entails a kind of narrative display of which certain exemplars become constitutive of the narrative. So the example engages a kind of reflection that helps us see more clearly how truth or kindness works. I tell the story, for example, I think about Frank Lloyd Wright, who was being sued because one of the houses he designed leaked. And when he was put on the witness stand, he was asked, "Would you please identify yourself?" And he said, "I'm Frank Lloyd Wright, the world's greatest architect." And when he got back to his lawyer's table, his lawyer said, "Oh, Mr. Wright, could you have refrained from that identification? It just turns the jury's teeth on edge." And Wright said, "What could I do? I was under oath." No, I give that as an example of humility.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So those are the kinds of examples that help us not let sentimentality determine what a virtue looks like.
So one of the ways that you describe grasping a virtue is to not let it fall into some version of populist sentimentality, and the other is to see that a virtue has on the other side of it a particular vice. Is that right? Do you see it that way? That's sort
right.
of virtue on one side and vice on the other. There has been a lot of conversation in society and culture, and it's happening a lot now, that there's a sense of morality sometimes that comes from particular people or ways of thinking that turn certain behaviors or actions into vices, and they really ought not be. And there's a debate, an argument about what really is a virtue. And so, like, one of the classic virtues is a kind of chastity, right? Sort of a sexual chastity. And there's a lot of people who have felt that the cultural or communal demand for chastity has really created a kind of repression and a kind of secrecy and a kind of dominance power of that desire and passion because it's put off as a vice, and that we need to approach it more honestly or more openly. And I hear the same thing about issues of anger. Like, hey, if we keep holding down our anger, we're going to, it's going to come out sideways. So I think that what I'm getting is there's this big debate about what classifies as a vice or not. It doesn't feel like there's as much of a debate, maybe among theologians and ethicists and moralists, about what is a virtue. But the argument feels like it's on the other side about what is a vice.
That's a set of really interesting comments. There is no virtue that isn't open to perversion. There is the vice is one of the ways of naming that. If you take courage, some people can think they are courageous because they literally have no fear at all. If they have no fear at all, interestingly enough, they're not courageous.
I see, yeah.
They're just foolhardy.
Right.
Now, how you make these kinds of discriminations is the way porcupines make love, very carefully. And I'm
going to Google that later for a video image of that.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to Google a video of how porcupines make love later. That's...
But the discriminations necessary to make these kinds of judgments about the vices depend on practical reason as an ongoing activity that's never finished. So, I mean, someone may be chaste because they have a deficient libido. But that doesn't mean that it's not possible for chastity to be a form of faithfulness to themselves and to the community in which they live as a way of gesturing the kind of lives we need to live as Christians that free us from being sexual predators.
Yeah, that's so. I'm really picking up this sense that while there are maybe a bit of a standard set of virtues, and they need to be communally held and taught, the personal interaction with those in your thinking is equally as important. That
Sure.
the particular human being, as they're living in a time and a space, in their own life, in their own development, that's equally as powerful in the application and the understanding of a virtue.
Right. But that makes possible the acquisition of habits. I mean, the virtues are habits that, and the way to think of these kinds of habits is they're skills. They're not just stimulus response. They're skills that will appear differently in different contexts. And
did you try to, when you were writing to Laurie, your godson in this book, in these letters, were you highly conscious of that part, the personal side and the skill development side? Is that what you're
I hope I was.
Yeah.
And I tried to give examples,
Sure.
Throughout.
Yeah, because it's you have a interesting comment where you say that Aristotle said that a child and a elderly person can't become true friends because their
Right.
lives are so different, and you say I hope that's not true. But boy, it just feels to people like their own experience or the cultural setting they're in, or what it means to be 15 years old in 2015 can seem so different than what it has felt like at other times and what the pressures are. But
yeah, I'm afraid that our social world is possessed by a kind of narcissism that threatens all our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you say that a kind of narcissism, do you mean that people only think about themselves, or are you saying that there's a sort of a societal misappropriated virtue that says it's all about you? Like, is it a person breaking from the cultural demand to only worry about themselves, or are you saying no? There's a whole societal coaching and nurturing.
More the latter.
Yeah,
more the latter. But the narcissist has the tendency to not know they're narcissistic.
Right.
So they are a great threat to themselves and everyone else around them.
Mm-hmm. Your conversation about virtue is particularly Christian. Like every religion that I know of advocates for virtues, different cultural perspectives over time, different philosophers and so on have their own set and list of virtues. What's particular about your Christian view when it comes to virtues, and how does that play out in what you were writing to Laurie?
The virtues finally must be given coherence by becoming conditions to be a follower of Christ. And that is no mean feat, because it will, for example, determine what it means to live a life that is free of deception. And that's a hard and demanding way of life. And I think it's constitutive of what it means to be a Christian.
Can you say a few more sentences about that? What is it about deception that's so powerful for you and rooted in that story?
Because give us an illusion anytime it's preferable to the acknowledgement that our lives are possessed by sin in a way we cannot will our way free of. And that is clearly a Christian presumption that not everyone shares.
What is the way free?
What is the way free?
Yeah, if you're not going to will your way free.
You don't will your way free. You discover you have a friend that will give you an alternative way of living. The idea that you will your way free is to only invite the kind of narcissism that we were talking of.
So you're saying that's going to be found in another. The pathway for you is going to be found in the life of another.
Right.
Man, that really raises the significance of how lonely people at least in the United States, feel. Like
I say that the great problem of contemporary America is the loneliness that people feel.
Yeah.
And the loneliness that people feel derives from the presumption that we are our own creators. My way of putting it is that we live in a world in which people believe they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story. And that's called freedom. The difficulty with that story is you didn't choose it. So Americans now find themselves fated to be lonely, and they call it freedom.
One of the ways that Christianity has tried to advocate for an embodied, lived set of virtues in a people is to do that through the organizing of church communities, right? And so churches are one of the primary experiments that Christian people have endeavored on to try to do this. And in the time that right now, and maybe over the last 100 years, churches haven't fared very well, and they haven't fared very well both institutionally, and they're not very highly thought of. I mean, I pastor one, and I'm fully a part of one, so I get this. Right. That sometimes, for some of us, they really do work. But on the whole, if churches are not going to be the places where the community forms to find this way and path of life that's inside of humanity and to find the way for it to manifest in someone in virtues and faith, where can that happen if in the way that you're thinking about the world? If we don't have those collectives of people, where do people find this?
The Army.
Really?
I mean, I'm a pacifist, but I admire.
Of all the words I thought you might say, Army was not on the list.
Oh, the Army's terrific. I have the Marines are better.
Oh my!
But
what now?
But my way of putting it is: no Jews, no Jesus. No Jesus, no church. And there is no Christianity without the church. And that just is the bottom line.
So, if churches are what you mean by the church the same as churches? Like the congregation,
yes.
Do you know what I mean? Okay.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I'm a congregational Catholic.
Uh-huh.
If there's no Christianity on your own. I mean, you get Americans saying things like, I believe Jesus is my personal Savior. He's Lord of history, but that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah. I say stuff like that, yeah.
It's awful.
Yeah. Well, okay, so if most people are not engaged in anything that would resemble that kind of a gathered congregation, of the broad Christians, doesn't that imply that this sense of Christian virtues will only be as available as the number of people who are engaged in that particular way of living and being?
Yes. Yes.
So you're really, there's a sense in which you're a church thriving advocate in order for these virtues to play out, huh?
Absolutely, and that the most antagonistic way to put it is outside the church there's no salvation.
Sure. Yeah.
A less antagonistic way to put it is without the church there's no salvation.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes you think what you mean by salvation.
Mm-hmm.
What you should mean by salvation is you've been made part of a body of people who are an alternative to the world's fears.
Yeah. And I guess it also invokes the question, what does it mean to be part of a church or part of the church in your way of thinking?
Yes.
So if someone has they engage in some of the practices some of the time, they listen to talks, they have a collection of books in their library, they talk with their friends, they kind of pray on their own. They sort of do it yourself with the instruction and picture of the church.
Do-it-yourself Christianity.
Yeah,
we're a faith that we housed by being handed on from another.
Mm-hmm.
I've really enjoyed this. I just have had friends that come in as an appointment.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm glad you have a chance for this conversation, Stanley. I really appreciate it. The book is called "The Character of Virtue: Letters to a Godson." It's not a kid's book, but in a lot of ways, it's a children's book. So it's fantastic.
I hope so.
Yeah, Stanley, thank you and congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Doug. It's lovely to meet you.
Yeah, bye-bye now.
Take care. Bye-bye. Well, how you doing?
Yeah, so there we go. Interesting conversation, huh? That last bit about the church, you maybe could hear it in my voice. I'm like, I'm not sure that's the only way to think about these things. It's a curious question, one that's meaningful to a lot of us. So hope you enjoy. Thanks so much for being faithful podcast listeners. And if you're new to the podcast, hey, there's plenty. I've done a bunch of these, and you might like all of them. So find your way around over on my Spreaker page or anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can look up Doug Pagitt Podcasts, and they go back a decade. So have fun.